the Americas.
The island is one of the larger ones in the Antilles and was originally occupied entirely by Spain, or claimed entirely by Spain.
The first Africans began to come into Hispaniola in the first quarter of the 16th century. The explosion really caused in the first half of the 18th century.
The first diocese in the New World was established by the Spaniards in the Catholic Church in Hispaniola. You have to keep in mind that in this period of time, the Catholic Church was sort of the social agent for cultural affairs for the Spanish monarchy.
The French, of course, being explorers as well and interested in colonial expansion, also saw the strategic importance of Hispaniola, located in this crossroads of the Caribbean, essentially began squatting on the western half of the island, which Spain showed less of an interest in. Ultimately, a formal government was established there late in the 17th century.
1697, Treaty of Weiswick provided for the acquisition of the western half. The Spanish kept the eastern half, the French got the western half.
Certainly Saint-Domingue had its rural components, but as a colonial place, it was often compared to Paris in the refinements of life that were there.
It very quickly developed into the most profitable of all of France's colonies in the 18th century.
Urban planning was following the guidelines that had been established in Europe. We even see that here in New Orleans, for example, with Jackson Square, the town plaza. In most cases, the town plaza would be built in the center of the city, surrounded by grid-like streets, except when the town was on a waterway. Then the town plaza would be placed on the waterway. Saint-Domingue had a drainage system, very active public works that had beautiful gardens, beautiful theaters, a Royal Academy, the only one in the French colonies. Both in the literary and in the musical arts, Saint-Domingue and the Caribbean islands were very, very advanced. For example, Haydn's symphonies were commissioned by Chevalier de Saint-Georges, a free person of color, went to France, eventually became a favorite composer of the nobility. And he was the person that commissioned Haydn's Paris symphonies.
If you were all white, you had everything and more that you had in Paris, except for a lot of poor whites.
The Code Noir, Black Code, was designed to regulate the conduct of African slaves and free people of color in the French colonies. And as France's colonial empire expanded, the version that was written to apply specifically to Louisiana was published in 1724.
The Code Noir, on paper, provided rights. They had the right to marry, and their marriage could not be divided by their master. So if you sold a slave, you had to sell his wife with him. You could not separate their children until they were teenagers. You had to sell a whole lot. Laws are often made, but for laws to be effective, they have to be obeyed.
Enforcement in the far-flung areas of the French Empire were not always strict, and it was not often followed.
Slaves, of course, were the very lowest level of the society, had little or no rights. In fact, you had a very harsh system of slavery, even worse than you had in the British North American colonies, because you had no such thing as a growing season. You could grow all year round, so there was always some work for your slaves to do.
Slavery was always passed along by the woman. If the woman was a slave and the man was free, the children would be born as slaves. Later on, there were laws that were passed that said that you couldn't free a woman before her 30th birthday. That was to get around some of the Code Noir. Usually by the 30th birthday, a woman had had her children at that period. So if she were a slave, her children would be slaves. But if she had been freed, then her children would be born as freed people.
There are many documented instances of liaisons between slave women and white men that produced offspring. Sometimes these offspring were claimed by the father, and that potentially provided a pathway to being recognized as a free person with more rights than a slave would have.
The free people of color did in fact occupy a legal status. It was sort of a third tier between the upper class whites and the petty blanc and then the slaves. So they did in fact have some recognized rights as a class of people, as opposed to just simply being black with some privileges because they were freed.
There were free people of color who owned slaves. There were a number of planters who were free people of color, who were the children of white planters, who inherited the plantation, inherited the slaves, and acted much like any other plantation owner.
The reality in Saint-Domingue was that you did in fact have these recognized groups, each having some privileges, and they really were not melded together. There was distance between free people of color and the slaves. You had some extremely well-off free people of color in the Caribbean colonies, and they certainly did not want to be identified with slaves. They didn't want to be identified in any case with Africans. They considered themselves to be as free, and since many of them were educated, as good as their white counterparts. And so you did have that separation.